Yeah. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. So I'm gonna ask y'all to excuse me for the awkward pause. The senator and the congresswoman are on their way, and I didn't want to start until they were close so we can get rolling. But we're gonna start with a quick video that's gonna explain a little bit about what we're gonna talk about today. So.
We live in a country right now where there's an incongruency between many states and what the federal government is doing. And a lot of this has been driven by a war on drugs, which has been a war on people. I grew up in an affluent area of New Jersey, and I watched how my friends would break drug laws. I went to Stanford University, to Yale University. People were breaking drug laws, but nobody's setting up sting operations. Nobody's stopping and frisking people.
This bill is extremely important because the history of marijuana prohibition is ridden with racial issues, and many of the people who are incarcerated are nonviolent drug offenders, much of which is linked to marijuana arrests.
Just as an 18-year-old getting arrested for a small quantity of marijuana, it ignited a lot of questions in my mind.
For the rest of your life, it's hard for you to get a job. You can't get many business licenses. You can't get a Pell Grant. You can't get food stamps, public housing. We have created a caste society in our country that's affected millions of people, concentrated in certain communities. When I announced my bill, everybody's like, yay, a bill to make marijuana legal. But the important pillars of the bill really are the ones after that. When you have a president who is openly hostile to what states are doing, you have to understand that those states may be legal, but they are still people who are selling marijuana, medical marijuana. They are violating federal law. So they are still subject to arrest. That puts everyone in this country in jeopardy. You literally have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans who are really hurt economically because once you have a conviction, your life options are radically constricted.
The war on drugs is a war on black people. And so when we talk about states' rights, it always has been and continues to be states' rights to oppress black people.
We have a generation of children who have grown up without any uncles, brothers, grandfathers, and fathers.
And one of the first and most important things I think to do to end this is to end the prohibition on marijuana.
So good afternoon. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Everybody enjoying the conference so far? Cool. My name is Chris Alexander. I'm a policy coordinator with the Drug Policy Alliance. We're excited to be here to tell you a bit about the DPA, about DPA. We are the nation's largest organization working to end the war on drugs. Now, what does that mean? That means that we need to shift our drug policy from one that's punitive, that's overtly racist, to one that focuses on science, health, and compassion. Our mission, as stated, is ending the war on drugs. And so we focus on marijuana primarily because it's one of the most widely used illicit drugs. That doesn't mean that we don't work on other drugs. We believe that we need to change the way that we deal with, that we address, that we support people who use drugs, and change the way that we look at these substances. Today, we're going to have an important conversation about what the future of marijuana reform looks like. As you know, 9 states and Washington, D.C. have moved to end marijuana prohibition. Some of those states have set up markets already, and others are in the process of doing so. There's also a long list of states that are in the process of moving beyond prohibition. It's a lot of excitement for us as advocates, but it also means that we've got to be very intentional. that we got to think about what the impact of these policies are going to be in the future. But that means first that we must recognize the harm that the policies of the past have caused. And so today we're going to go into the history of criminalization. We're going to talk about what marijuana policies have been across the country and in different states specifically. But we're also going to talk about what the legacy of marijuana prohibition is going to be. As we build up this new industry, we've noticed a couple of different things. One, the industry is overwhelmingly white. Very, very white, like really white. And the fact that prohibition enforcement has been focused so much in communities of color means that that's something that doesn't sit well with us as advocates, particularly as people who are helping to bring about that change and bring about that industry. So we stand here with the mantle of responsibility to make sure that how we move things forward is responsible to the past. Two, we recognize that marijuana reform and ending marijuana prohibition in and of itself is not the only criminal justice issue of relevance at the moment. It's not the only criminal justice issue that is necessary to take force immediately. And so we recognize the other parallel movements that are going to make our nation, our states, fairer and more equitable. And then lastly, we recognize the economic impact that marijuana prohibition has had on communities. And so as we build a new industry, as we create something special here in our country that's unique, an industry that focuses on the past as it builds forward, we want to make sure that we're creating the proper supports for folks who want to get into, participate, and thrive in this new economic market. And so without further ado, I do want to introduce Congresswoman Barbara Lee to give a couple of comments. And as these members walk up to the stage, I do want to also just, as from the advocate perspective, just say what a debt of gratitude we have to folks who are willing to step out and lead on this issue. Just a couple of years ago, marijuana reform was an absolute fringe issue, and members have stepped out and said that this was important, that this was necessary for our communities. So I just want to take that point of personal privilege to say thank you. Without further ado, Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank our panelists, because I think this is the first time we've held one of our workshops during the ALC weekend on really marijuana justice, and that's what this is. That's what this is. So God, this is really awesome to see everybody here. And I just have to say to our Senator, Cory Booker, you know, it is just, he'll be speaking in just a minute, so I'm going to be very brief. But it is just remarkable to have a member of the United States Senate taking on these tough issues that sometimes it's only a couple of us taking on in the House. And now Senator Booker, I mean, to have him be a Senate sponsor of the Marijuana Justice Act, as well as many other bills that we need to have some strong leadership on in the Senate. He's the one, he's the man, and we really thank him so much for his leadership and for his steadiness and persistence, because we know that sooner or later, this will be the law of the land. So thank you again, Cory, very much. Just a couple of statistics I'd like to mention, because you're going to hear it over and over today, but what's driving a lot of these issues, whether you agree with legalization, decriminalization, medical marijuana legalization, or whatever, the point is we have states now, and my state is one, there are about 9 states which have legalized both recreational and medical. Some states haven't, some states have. Over 30 states have legalized medical marijuana. This is first of all, it's a booming industry. And so we have to make sure that those who have been affected most by this horrific, horrible war on drugs, which of course led to mass incarceration of African American men and women, we need to crack that and stop that right now. And that's what justice is all about. And so what we're doing is trying to make sure that all of the aspects of this new form of slavery, in many ways, is stopped. African Americans are more likely, I think it's 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana charges. African Americans and Latinos make up nearly 80% of our nation's marijuana possession arrests. And And so when you talk about criminal justice reform, we have to talk about also restorative justice. And so in our legislation, we have, I think it's about a $500, $600 million fund for restorative justice, for job training, for entrepreneurial opportunities, for those, for education, for helping to provide those wrongly convicted a second chance. Because everyone deserves a second chance, especially those convicted of marijuana offenses. We've got to reinvest profits from this emerging industry back into underserved communities, into communities that have been devastated by the war on drugs. So this is not just a financial benefit, it's really a step towards justice. And so we have to foster equity in the cannabis industry also. And so marijuana justice has a lot of dimensions. It has a lot of dimensions, but this conversation is so important because I know in the Congressional Black Caucus, we finally have our principles around marijuana justice. And you know, in many of our communities, we need to educate more people. I've had, in my district, members of the clergy in meetings to talk about why this is a key strategy, a key reform, to really begin to make sure that African American men don't end up in this in prisons and in the pipeline to mass incarceration. And so what you're going to do today and what this panel is doing will help us go back to our communities and beat that drum. Because you know, in Congress, we need co-sponsors on legislation. And so we have several other pieces of legislation that we're working on also, but this is the one we wanted to talk about today because I think it's so important for those who care about criminal justice reform and fairness and equity and justice, that you go back to your communities and you ask your member of Congress, whether they're a member of the Congressional Black Caucus or not, sit down with them, talk to them, and tell them why they need to be a co-sponsor on this legislation, because it's all about numbers, and you know what we're going to do in November. Okay, you know what we're going to do. So let's be prepared to do that after November in terms of beating that drum to build support to get this bill passed. So I know from my district, you know, I'm from Oakland, California, where it's like power to the people, Wakanda forever. And we're a community that stays woke. And I know all of you here are very woke, and I know Senator Cory Booker is the wokest man in the Senate. So thank you again, Senator Booker. Thank you, guys.
So in the New York office of the Drug Policy Alliance, we do a lot of work with elected officials on the state and local level as they're recognizing and learning about drug policies to make sure they understand the harm that some of these policies have caused. This is a practice that we do across the country, but I've been in the New York office, so I want to talk about New York. And so right across the river is New Jersey. And Senator Booker has been working with our office in New York and office in New Jersey since he was mayor in Newark. And so we want to recognize you again. Yeah. So I want to recognize you again for the work that you've done as well on this issue. And, you know, please say a few words about what you think this looks like moving forward. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Booker.
I just want to be quick because I think this panel is going to be fierce. And this is the first time that we've had a panel like this at the CBC. And thank God, we had a heated debate in the CBC around marijuana. And the point that Barbara Lee, where is she, over here, she was the first one out of the block speaking on our side of the issue in that debate. And I wanted to be very candid. There was some resistance to this. But when Barbara Lee put it down hard and just said, look, this is not an issue about like I'm pro-marijuana. I've never drank alcohol in my life, not to mention use cannabis. Because for me, it's not about that. It is about justice. It is about equality. It is about opportunity, which I'm going to get to in a second. And we decided after this robust debate that we weren't saying everybody go out there and use marijuana. We were simply saying on the federal level, we should deschedule marijuana and allow the states to make their own decisions. And I'm so proud that the CBC, one debate, it wasn't a little drawn out, And we came back with a set of principles that I'm very proud of. And if anybody wants to say thank you, because this is not an issue that's fully accepted in our communities either, in African-American communities, please give her another round of applause for leading this fight. Yes. And I want to say, look, when I sat down to write the marijuana justice law, I sat down to write it because I was angry. And I was angry because I saw all the nation moving towards marijuana legalization for adult use, and moving towards medical marijuana, of which I have legislation on. But my anger about this is that no one seems to be giving any attention to the devastating damage prohibition has done to poor communities throughout America and communities of color in particular. It has devastated communities. You have people who are serving lifetime sentences for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing.
Come with it.
You have the hypocrisy in this body, the Congress of the United States of America, that there's a whole lot of Congress people who have used marijuana, I dare say senators as well, but yet they are blocking changes in laws that are persecuting Americans. And some people say, Cory, you said lifetime sentence. Who gets a lifetime sentence? Nobody's being arrested for marijuana. Well, first of all, 2016 data, there were more people arrested for marijuana crimes than violent crimes in America. And that when you get arrested, even if you serve no jail time, it is a lifetime sentence. How? Well, if you're from Florida, you lose your right to vote for life. Can't get a Pell Grant, business licenses. You can't get a job at a Burger King or a fast food joint in Newark. It is a lifetime sentence. And knowing that these laws have been applied in different areas differently, there is nobody, I went to Stanford, a whole lot of drug use going on. Nobody's stopping and frisking people coming home from parties. So if you have presidents admitting in their books, like President Obama did, not just marijuana, felony drug use, and you have people that already have de facto legalized marijuana because nobody's being arrested in many of our privileged communities, like the one I grew up in. But yet you have communities of color and poor communities, African Americans in this country, 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana use, even there's no difference in usage in the United States of America. And so this is not about, hey, go out and smoke pot. This is a justice issue. This is an equality issue. This is crazy that we have around drug laws. Brian Stevenson's right. You have a nation that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent. And so this legislation that's already been outlined by Congresswoman Lee is about restorative justice, Because prohibition has been devastating to the United States of America. Devastating and nonsensical. By this being a Schedule I drug on the same level as harsh barbiturates and other things, we can't even study the drug adequately. To have children who fall into seizures with Dravet syndrome, and the parents who try to get their kids the only drug that seems to help, veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder who can't get from the VA the only medicine that works. I have doctors writing me letters saying that marijuana is not an on-ramp drug, it's an off-ramp drug because people with opioids find the drug helpful in getting off opioid addiction. But yet in this country, we're criminalizing those parents trying to help their children. We're criminalizing veterans who are disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system. And now let me get the last anger off my mind. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little upset, y'all. I don't mean the last piece of anger. The last piece of anger I want to tell you that our bill does not cover. The last bit of anger here, I have to say, and you all need to help me with this. If you're going to help me with anything, post about this. Put this up on social media. Get this chip off your shoulder, please. That now that some states are rushing to legalize, that you have all these people that were in the marijuana business before it was legal, that suddenly are being excluded from the economic opportunities that are being created now that the business is legalized. You have folk with all this capital who are rushing in, and small entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, and minority entrepreneurs are not getting opportunities at the businesses being created. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's coming. And if it's suddenly dominated by pharmaceutical industries or dominated by big banks and big investment firms, and people that don't look like this panel, of women entrepreneurs and minority entrepreneurs don't get an opportunity, or the guy with a nonviolent marijuana possession charge can't even get a job, that's not justice either. We need to be proactive. If you're going to set up marijuana dispensaries in communities of color or urban communities, the community should be benefiting from it in economic opportunities, jobs, and ownership opportunities. I am really worried about our country as we rush towards legalization, that we are losing this understanding of restorative justice and an opportunity to create economic empowerment in communities that have been economically devastated by the drug war. Because when you focus a drug war in certain communities, you take away that community's economic power. When somebody has just an arrest on their life, their lifetime earnings go down. A conviction for possession of marijuana, your lifetime earnings go down. And so I'm excited about this panel. I'm excited about the activism around there, and I am in this fight. I am in this fight for justice, for the veteran, for the poor folks, for the children suffering from illnesses, for the communities that have been devastated like the one in which I live in the Central Ward of Newark, New Jersey. So thank you all for this opportunity. Thank you all for being here. And I'm telling you right now, I talked about this issue in another panel. It was packed to the rack, packed, standing room only. This is perhaps one of the most important discussions that's being had at this entire conference because it affects every area of our country. It affects our economy. It affects our health and well-being. It affects our children. It may seem like, oh, Cory, this is just about marijuana. No, it's not. It's about justice, justice, justice. And if we have our way, justice will roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I think the senator did an awesome job of setting the frame of what this conversation is going to be about. I like to say that, this has never really been about freeing the weed, although we need to free the weed. No, this is squarely, primarily a criminal justice issue. By virtue of what happens post-prohibition, this becomes an economic justice issue. By virtue of what's happened in the way prohibition has been enforced for the last 40 years across the country, this is a racial justice issue. And so I hope you all come to this conversation recognizing that this has little to do with the plant at all. The war on drugs has been said in that video that you all saw before the panel started. Has been a war on people of color, primarily black people, primarily Latino people across this country. In my home state of New York, in my home city, New York City, it has literally devastated entire generations. Communities, we've had over almost 1 million arrests in the last 20 years for simple, low-level possession. And what that has done to the communities across the state of New York, for example, has been terrible. And so as we work towards reform, we gotta move with that knowledge squarely in our minds. And so we're gonna talk today, we're gonna get right into it. We have an awesome panel in front of you, experts who work on this issue on a daily basis from a variety of perspectives, a variety of levels of expertise, a variety of avenues of expertise, but all folks who understand and agree that it's time to end marijuana prohibition. It's time to do so now. I want to start first with the issue that I think really brings us to the table, the issue of criminal justice reform. We are in a moment where a lot of criminal justice reform issues are being brought to the surface and being focused on by folks as conservative as the Koch brothers and folks as far left as Bernie Sanders. They recognize that the criminal justice system as we have it does not work. It doesn't make people currently more safer, and in fact, in many cases, it perpetuates violence and crime in communities. Now, Jasmine, I want to start with you. You've been working on this issue for a very long time. Tell me where marijuana reform sits and why, really, the importance that marijuana reform has as a criminal justice reform issue.
Sure. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon and for choosing this panel. I agree that it is one of the most important panels that's being held during this year's CBC Foundation ALC. I'm Jasmine Tyler. I'm a sociologist. I work at Human Rights Watch, and Human Rights Watch is one of the world's leading organizations that's documenting human rights conditions around the world in about 90 countries and reporting on those and using those reports to really change the conditions for individuals on the ground and allow people to redress their governments. So I have, though, as Chris mentioned, worked in this space for a long time. I'd like to say I'm the OG on this panel because I used to work at the Drug Policy Alliance about more than 10 years ago or so. I know it looks like I just got out of high school. But I can't even tell you, as Representative, okay, no. I cannot even tell you how far this conversation has gone. I mean, you heard Senator Booker reference Representative Lee's long-term effort on this, but I have to tell you, I am so surprised that there's a panel and legislation that seeks to empower and affirm the participation of drug war survivors in a new burgeoning legitimate economy and opportunity that's flourishing around the country. I have been in Representative Charlie Rangel's office from New York, where his senior staff has told us that if blacks get picked up or arrested more for holding marijuana, that they just shouldn't have it on them. This conversation has evolved, okay? And I think it's also important to note that it's not just within the Congressional Black Caucus who has taken this on, but it's the Congressional Black Caucus, just like with the reform of the crack disparity, has taken the lead on really reframing and reforming this conversation around marijuana, because the CBC's efforts have actually pushed Democratic leadership in the Senate to change their positions. And I have to swear to y'all, I never thought I would live to see the day that Senators Chuck Schumer and Dianne Feinstein endorsed marijuana policy.
Yeah.
You want me to go on?
No. I mean, that's setting the frame. This has been, I mean, there's been some movement here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Significant movement.
And I think, what I think is important is like how marijuana reform has become a criminal justice issue, right? Like, because before maybe it was thought of as somewhat of a fringe issue. Like, what has that process been like? What did that take?
So I think it happened because of the strong support around reforming the crack powder laws 10 to 15 years ago. When the communities on the right and on the left really galvanized and started working together to really reduce this egregious mandatory minimum. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but for a very long time, crack cocaine was punished 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine at the federal level, despite the fact that powder cocaine is the main ingredient. So what happened was African Americans who were experiencing drug law enforcement at greater rates in our communities became the only people who were serving this egregious time. So African Americans were serving 88% of people serving time for crack in the federal system were African American, though public health data showed us at the same time that they were only 1/3 users. So after we passed the Fair Sentencing Act, which significantly reduced, did not eliminate, nor provide retroactive application of the crack disparity to 18-1, so from 100-1 to 18-1. So rest assured, Congress, only 1/5 racist still. I helped to sort of lead the reframing of the marijuana arrest issue in the racial justice frame that we had used during the crack powder advocacy campaign. One thing that I used and carried around with me, I wish I had old copies of this, were tables from a dear friend of the movement, Harry Levine, Dr. Harry Levine from CUNY CUNY Queens College, who did for me tables of every state, all 50 states, the disparities in arrest rates for white, black, and Latino. And it wasn't in color. It wasn't like Latinos were like orange and blacks were like gray. It was Latinos were brown and blacks were white, or blacks were black and whites were white. And so it was really jarring even for us to see it so starkly depicted, but it really helped to get it to sink in so that these were real people, right? Not some imaginary color depicting these real people. And I think, doing the legwork that I did, I have to say, it was just me back then, in a sea of white libertarians, I have to tell you, right? That's the other, you said you wanted to free the weed.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, the weed has been free, okay? It's been de facto free for white folks. It's not been, free for us. So, the reality was just walking to every office and showing them what those tables look like in their states, in their local districts, and saying, are you going to let this stand? And eventually, a critical mass of people decided that they were not. And so here, today, we have Queen Adesiwe, who is the next generation, who has literally introduced this bill and gotten co-sponsors for it. So this is the evolution that we're talking about. Like, Senator Booker said, he quoted MLK, I'll quote him too. Whew, that arc, it is long.
Yeah.
But it bends, and it bends towards justice.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here real fast because that's from a higher perspective. My name is Dr. Shonda Macias, and I have a medical marijuana dispensary here in Washington, D.C. And so what that means to me in my community is that when I go to hire individuals that are from my community, that are born and raised in Washington, D.C., with the previous possession record, I cannot hire them. And we did not accept this. So based upon what our community said, we went back and fought. Malik is in the room who helped with that reform. And with that, we are now able to hire individuals that have possession nonviolent charges. So we have to take it state by state. We have to fight for our community. We have to bring awareness to these issues to support each other. So that's how it looks like on my level.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to get back to the criminal justice aspect of this issue. Maritza, we're going to, you've done a lot of work on this issue as well, and I want to get into some of the specific crimes, because we're seeing disparities. You're hearing disproportionate rates of arrests. Nationwide, black people are 4 times more likely. We've heard these rates, these numbers. What's some of the specific ways that marijuana prohibition has harmed individuals who are arrested or convicted of a marijuana offense?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. But first, I'll give a little introduction of myself. My name is Maritza Perez, and I'm with the Center for American Progress. They're a progressive think tank. They work on policy issues. I think people are having a hard time hearing me, but they work on a variety of policy issues, and I work on criminal justice reform there. Before joining the Center for American Progress, I worked at an organization called MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. It's a Latino civil rights law firm, very similar to what the NAACP LDF does, but for Latino civil rights issues. And that's where I was really digging into criminal justice issues. And what I found was that I couldn't really work on criminal justice without talking about immigration, because we found that so many people ended up who were entrapped in the criminal justice system had to face immigration consequences as a result. But before I get into that, I did want to say it is very exciting what Senator Booker said that this is the first time that the CBC has hosted a panel on marijuana. It's actually the first time that CHCI, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, had a panel on marijuana. I was just at that like 2 days ago. So I really do believe that the tide is turning on this issue, which is really, really exciting. And I feel honored that I get to be part of the education process. So back to my work at MALDEF, I was working on various criminal justice issues, and what I found was that a lot of folks who were non-citizens had to deal with those consequences for a really long time, really a lifetime, and they often served double punishment. What I mean by that is that people would serve time in jail or in prison, but then ICE would put an immigration hold on them. And after serving their sentences, they would then be deported. And we're still seeing a lot of that. You may have heard of the term crimmigration. So when people say crimmigration, that's often what they're referring to. But the consequences run steep. It's not just immigration consequences that happen to people, especially if you're a citizen. Just having a record, even if you spend no time in jail or prison, could really harm somebody's life opportunities. It could close many doors to you. It could make you, it could make some types of housing unavailable to you. It could make it so some loans are not available to you, some licenses, some business licenses may not be available to you. So it really does have all sorts of consequences, even if you don't serve any time, just having that conviction. So one thing I really wanted to talk about, and something that Senator Booker's bill does, is that it deschedules marijuana. So descheduling marijuana, taking it off, making it so it's not it's not illegal at the federal level, would do so much good for citizens and non-citizens alike. So I hope that we have an opportunity to talk about that later today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. You know, Cory Booker, Senator Booker also brought up, you know, the fact that this has lasting consequences on communities. And so I want to kind of open this one up to the panel to jump into in terms of what, you know, he talked about the economic consequences, but some of the other consequences we've seen, how a community is impacted by decades of disproportionate marijuana enforcement. So, Dr. G, you can grab that.
So, good afternoon, everyone. So to kind of touch on that, I wanted to rehash a few known facts. So this country is the #1 country in terms of incarceration rate. This is something that probably everyone in this audience is well aware of. We have 2.3 million folks locked in cages here in the United States, which is, you know, 10 times higher than some of these other countries that we often say have backwards politics, places like Cuba, China, Russia. So we're incarcerating more people than any other country in the entire world. We make up about 5% of the total global population, yet we make up a quarter of the folks who are locked in cages around the globe are here in the United States. So 25% of people locked up in cages around the globe are here in the United States. And so, you know, what does that mean to us? You know, we've been framing this whole thing here about what does that mean to our communities? What does it mean to us individually? And, you know, I can say that it means a person like myself sitting here in front of you. So I'm a formerly incarcerated person with not one, not two, but 3 felony convictions. I'm from the Ferguson, Missouri area, and growing up in that area, I started selling drugs at a very young age. I got arrested for the first time when I was still just a teenager at 14 years old. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was sitting in front of a judge facing 20 years to life for drug trafficking. The prosecutor, due to the nature of how the country was at this time, this tough on crime, in the heart of the war on drugs, there was, you know, the prosecutor had prosecutorial discretion. So what ended up happening, she ended up prosecuting me as a prior and persistent career criminal. So she painted this picture of me as this, you know, and you guys are looking at me now like this was a little while ago. And I still look young. So you can imagine over 15 years ago how young I looked when I was this 20-year-old kid sitting in this courtroom, and this prosecutor was pushing for 20 years to life. So she was trying to put me away for life. And my drug charges were primarily dealing with marijuana and also some other issues. But she framed it as if I was this, you know, dangerous person, and her terminology was that I had no hope for changing. I was messing up as a juvenile. I continued to make poor decisions to the point that I was sitting in front of them with 3 felony convictions, and she wanted to throw me away for life. I was eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison, and if I could even step back to even before that courtroom, before sitting in that courtroom, to touch on some of the different disparities that take place. So we were under investigation for roughly 9 months before this drug task force raid that ended up that came down on us. And you know, at this particular time, you know, this, you know, something that most folks can't really relate to, but you know, I was sitting with, you know, officers in their SWAT gear, and you know, I had 50 assault rifles, you know, aimed at my head. And you know, looking back on that time, I could have easily been Mike Brown sitting there dead in the streets, and all they would have said is, oh, just another young black thug selling drugs. Who really cares? Black lives don't matter, really, right? So, the narrative, just, thinking back on that, and now where I am now, as this prosecutor was saying that I have no hope for change, and I'm now sitting in front of you as an endocrinologist scientist, a professor at not one but two world-renowned institutions.
HU.
You know? So I'm a endocrinologist scientist and professor at Howard University College of Medicine, and I'm also adjunct assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Medicine. So, I would say that I changed just a little bit from what she was saying.
Just a little bit.
And I could definitely go a little bit deeper in a little later, but.
Yeah, I think there's some things that I definitely want to pull out from that, right? The experience of living under surveillance for a community like what that does to generations, right? And limiting opportunity and limiting advancements and creating the narrative that there is no growth, there is no future for you. One thing that we talk about often is how easy it is to throw away people when there's the perception that they are no good. For example, people who use drugs. We all know somebody who uses drugs. We all use drugs in a sense, in form you drink your coffee, you have your sugar, but people who use drugs are oftentimes disparaged and thought of as folks who are less than. I think that's kind of part of one of the issues that we're trying to undo as we continue to move this thing forward.
Chris, I want to jump in here because this young man, or maybe not so young anymore, he sold drugs for a living and he faced 10 years. I sell pounds of marijuana and I have no fear of that right now. How unfair is that?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, I represent less than 4% of minorities in this industry. So the other 96% are doing exactly the same thing that he was doing and making millions off of it. This is what we're talking about. Reform has to take place. It is unfair. It is obvious. And until our voice is unified and we can fight together, this will continue to happen.
Yeah. Thank you.
The judge was wrong. He didn't need to change. The law needed to
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That's what we could talk. Yeah, perfect segue. Perfect segue. We're going to Queen.
Yeah, I just wanted to pull apart
hold
that
on,
part.
Queen, just real quick. I do want to make sure that we highlight the wonderful work that this young woman is doing here and leading this movement right now in D.C. Y'all to understand that this is incredibly important to recognize her and the work that she's done to build this point where the CBC has endorsed marijuana legalization. That's crazy. So Queen, take it away. But I want to ask you, get to the policy question, because people are asking, and you brought up, the industry does not represent, really, it looks like as if at this moment, the industry is not responsible to the history of enforcement and what it's looked like in the past, the fact that you would bar people with previous convictions from being employed in the industry, the fact that you would bar people with previous convictions from being licensed in the industry in certain places, experts who've been doing it, right? I want to talk about, what does policy look like? What does future look like? How do we do this right?
So again, Queen Adesui, I'm a policy coordinator with the Drug Policy Alliance's Office of National Affairs here in DC. The future looks like the Marijuana Justice Act and even more. I'm glad Dr. Stanley got to talk. I don't think we need to be scapegoating drug sellers. I think often in this movement, we talk about nonviolent marijuana offenses, nonviolent simple possession, but people who sell drugs should not be scapegoated as we're moving towards marijuana reform.
Absolutely.
So policies that include provisions that expunge records, resealing, resentencing for people in jail, thinking about where the profits of marijuana need to be going. This is a new industry, this is all new money, so being intentional about where the profits are going. The social change that can come out of the profits from marijuana is really deep. As we see California, they did a great job with allocating money towards, Oakland allocated money towards, getting rid of convictions of marijuana for folks. There's a lot of legal clinics. Our California office has been doing a great job with people who are non-citizens and working on that issue. But with the Marijuana Justice Act, I think it's First of all, sorry, I'm really nervous.
She spends her days.
I'm really nervous, sorry,
She
y'all.
spends her days convincing senators and members of Congress that they need to support marijuana reform. So she's no need to be nervous here.
Yeah, it's a really tough issue just because marijuana reform, right, as it is right now, is a bipartisan issue. But folks on the left and folks on the right oftentimes find it hard to stand up for people with records. Just yesterday, we were at a markup with the first marijuana bill to see the light of a markup in the last few years. And folks are having a really healthy debate about whether or not we should include language that bans people with records in the expansion of marijuana research. So this is Representative Gates introduced a bill that would expand the capacity to do research around medical cannabis. One of the issues we have with marijuana is that we don't have federal research, and that's because it's a Schedule I drug. Leaving it as a controlled substance, it's not just illegal and it's not just an issue for folks on the street, but it causes issues for scientists and researchers to really put out the medicinal benefits of marijuana. Even though we don't want to keep the conversation about marijuana being a beneficial substance for individuals, it's a criminal justice issue. But truly, the problem with prohibition is that folks are losing out from the benefits of marijuana. I hope you get to talk more about patients. But the fact that we have senators and representatives arguing about we should have people with integrity to do research on marijuana, and really the stigmatization of drugs is the problem, because people stigmatize marijuana and they stigmatize and racialize folks who use drugs. So the idea that anyone who has a conviction for marijuana obviously can't work at a manufacturing research facility. So I think we need to continue to push our elected officials to stand up for justice and stand up for people.
Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Macias, I want to come to you. I do want to just spend a moment, something that Queen brought up there, that this is also kind of preventing the greatest good that this plant can deliver to the community in terms of health benefit. Now, you yourself are a patient advocate. I want to hear just a little bit about some of the benefits that we've learned so far that people have been able to learn with the limited research base that we have.
Definitely. So my name is Dr. Shonda Macias. I am two-time Howard graduate, graduated as a cell biologist, studied cancer for about 10 years, and then went into infectious diseases. Had multiple grants from NSF, NIH, DOD. So we have quite a history of being able to research, biomedical research based upon cannabis. So when I opened up National Holistic Healing Center in Washington, D.C., the one thing I wanted to focus on is patient care. Now, in my community, because I am conscious of what health disparities occur amongst our population, primarily you can see it in prostate cancer, breast cancers, and more aggressive forms, I wanted to make sure that the work that we were doing, mainly it's called ailment strain alignment, taking specific strains and aligning them up with different disease and different disease states. But when I entered the industry, the first thing that I noticed is that the Black person, the minority person who was in fact a prisoner, went to jail because they were a patient. Mm-hmm. So let me get this straight with you again. Patients went to prison for using marijuana, and now I'm treating over 5,000 people who are patients and they do not have prison records. So that is a whole class of individuals that have been penalized for using medicine for a healthcare benefit because it was saving their lives and they went to prison for it. Let's get that clear. The second thing is that when we see a patient in our dispensary, we definitely focus on the medicine. The medicine comes in multiple forms, whether it's a flower form, whether it's a concentrated form, whether it's an edible form. There are different forms of medical marijuana that helps patients. I've been collecting data on this. I've worked with individuals, collaborated on these ideas, and there are substantial findings to support this. Our patients are reforming their health. They are having a better sense of well-being. And in some cases, like the opioid epidemic, I am saving lives every day. Yes. So this is a very serious issue from the patient perspective. What I hate in this industry right now from a healthcare provider is that people choose to use medical marijuana right before they are in a critical health state where it should be their first option to consider when seeking health care benefits. So if you come to me at stage 4 cancer, it's too late for me to help you. And you need to understand that if you need the help and you value your life, you have to fight for this. Because until we decide that we care enough about our health care and are advocates for it, we will not see change, especially in our community that face ailments and conditions that are specific to us. So I'm gonna leave it there because I get a little passionate about this. And that's why I know I'm here today, because I speak upon those that don't have a voice.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing, and not just with cancer patients, but with people who are struggling with HIV and AIDS-related complications too, because in Washington, D.C., we have one of the highest rates of HIV infections. And as you saw my mom on that video, this is not just like a one-person job, right? This is our family's job. My mom is an HIV prevention nurse. I do policy related to all of these issues because I grew up visiting my dad in prison. He was a drug seller. He was very good at what he did because on his 18th birthday, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And he grew up in a segregated school in colonial Williamsburg, where my family ancestors were slaves for Presidents Tyler and Madison. So he had very limited legitimate opportunities and was good in the illicit market. However, he eventually contracted HIV, and he has since passed, but this was my mom and I's life dealing with this. He almost died in prison when I was a junior in college. And I just want to say, you know, for so long I did this work because of my dad, right? I was like my call to do this work. But now I have a 5-year-old, and my mom and I do this work for him, for the world we want him to grow up in, right? And, you know, he just learned the Pledge of Allegiance, and he's in kindergarten. It's been 3 weeks, and I'm like, the injustice for all part is the most important. Like, right? Like, if he's gonna learn anything. But yeah. I wanna just reemphasize what it's like, because these are patients. These are people with legitimate skills and expertise who could be employed in other milieu, right? Economic milieu. But it's one arrest every 25 seconds for a drug offense. Every 25 seconds. And like Cory Booker said, it's more arrests for marijuana than for violent crimes. And out of those marijuana arrests, it's more for possession than actually distribution. Like I said, lots of people have been able to use marijuana, white people, without being criminalized like this. This is about us. Harry Anslinger, the first drug czar who created all this mess, he used to give Joe McCarthy his heroin. He was a heroin addict. He made a way for the congressman who created the Red Scare and terrorized countless Americans. There was a way for him.
Yeah. Mic drop. Thank you. Thank you. You know, this is, the Drug Policy Alliance has done a lot of work on legalizing marijuana for adult use, squarely because it came from our work of trying to end prohibition. We had to think about what comes next, right? What are we building? What are we leaving in place once we tear down this structure? And there was a way to do it responsibly. there were gaps in that approach. There have been and still are gaps. And there are entire organizations, there's entire movement now that's recognizing that there's gaps to fill and that there's a way to do that. The point that you just brought up, Jasmine, which brings me to this question, was about the fact of people who were good at what they did, who probably just needed some support so that the business can get off the ground. If they were working today in this industry, they would have been considered entrepreneurs and savants, and they'd be on the cover of GQ and Fortune, right? They'd be called, you know, I don't know, weed moms who are, you know, or moguls or whatever.
Jeff Bezos and like.
We've seen these people on the cover of Fortune as the emerging, the people who are on the really cutting edge of the newest industry. Well, I think the person on the cutting edge is at the end of this table. And I want Lenise to say a little bit about what type of supports we've actually been providing to folks who are trying to get into this industry, who look like us, who deserve a place to stand, but just need a helping hand.
Okay. So my name is Lenise, and I'm a co-founder of an organization called the Hood Incubator. The Hood Incubator seeks to increase political and economic power for Black communities harmed by the drug war. To do that, we do community organizing, we do policy advocacy, and we also do economic development work. Me and my co-founders, we first started with the economic development work. We both have MBAs, and we separately in different schools, we saw issues. While I was in school, I went to school in Marin County, that's in the Bay Area of California, and I was going to school with some white folks at the time, and you know, folks were casually talking about, you know, their weed businesses, or, you know, I know folks are trapping on the side, you know. It was a green MBA, so there was a lot of weed happening. And at the same time, I was working at a community organization, and I was doing electoral organizing, and I was running phone banks and canvases, and this was in Oakland. And so what we did in Oakland, where the POC and the low-income folks live in the flatlands, and the rich folk live in the hills. So we would organize folks in the flatlands to talk to their neighbors in the flatlands. So we would have a lot of formerly incarcerated folks. 80% of my team was usually formerly incarcerated. And what I noticed is that if you know anything about campaign work, it's very brief, 3 to 8 weeks at a time. And I realized that these were the only, for most of my staff, these were their only earned income gigs for the year. The rest of the time, they were hustling. I remember one instinct where I was walking down the street from home to work, and there was an SRO, single room occupancy, and there was a lot of underground activity going on in there. And one day, someone walked out the building, it's a wad of cash in his hand, and he made eye contact. It was not a big thing, but person happened to be my staff. He made eye contact with me, and he looked so guilty. Like he looked like he was ashamed that I saw him in that position. I was ashamed that I had an MBA and all I was able to offer someone was a 3-week job. I was like, go ahead, brother, make your money. You know, I'm not giving you a real job. This 3-week thing ain't gonna do it. So there's that to think about. And then at the same time, me and my brother, we're both from New York. We're both wards of the state. We did get fostered into a home, but we had different educational trajectories. I went off to do like college and then an MBA program, and he didn't finish high school completely. And so one thing that he was really good at though is culinary. And so what my brother used to do is he would, under 215, he had the ability to procure weed, make it into an edible, and then go find what they call patients, and then sell it to them and get donations for that. And he was able to make a living this way for a while. When we think about legalization, we have to think about what's happening, and they're regulating. In California, it was regulating the rest of the supply chain. My brother is no longer able to take care of himself from selling the edibles that he made. With regulation, now some people just have decided to continue on in the black market, or not the black market, in the underground. But I think because of my position, in the public's face, my brother has decided that that's not probably the best move to make because they're checking for Negroes, and people don't probably like the work that I'm trying to push. So we didn't want to make him a target. So he used to be able to make his wares and his edibles and, go to the park and come home with $600. He didn't have to really have a job. He has, with chronic unemployment issues as a black person or a woman in this industry, that's the average person. The average person that's selling cannabis, that's a cannabis drug dealer, is not a kingpin, is not sitting around with a bunch of guns. What I really noticed is in my work of organizing black drug cannabis dealers is that it's a lot of aunties, it's a lot of parents, it's fathers, it's families. I've been involved in rooms where we were having drug transactions, drug transactions, and there were kids there. There were no guns there. There were kids there, and it was a very respectable situation. But what's changing is that with regulation is that these folks that have been able to make a way for themselves have been not going around gunning up neighborhoods. And all the craziness that they want to show you on TV. That's not the normal. That's not the normal. They're losing their way. And so with the Hood Incubator, me and my co-founder, we said, all right, folks need to be able to transition. People like my brother need to be able to transition. But without access to education beforehand, without access to business development skills, without access to, let's think about it. Who, as a black person, who would be most likely to be successful in transitioning? Probably a black person that has already survived white America in this professional corporate America, and then is going to take that skill set and transfer it over. Let's also be honest. If you're a black person and you went and you survived white America, you're not about to give up everything that you worked hard for to try something out at cannabis. So it's hard for us. So what we do at the Hood Incubator is we try and find those black entrepreneurs that have what it takes to be trainable, that has a good idea, and try and give them the resources, the community, access to all the industry accoutrements that's needed so that they can launch or grow a business. What's necessary, what's missing is capital. We need capital behind this. We need, and more than that, we don't need white capital. We don't need VC capital. Not saying that we don't want to take it. If you're ready, not all businesses are investment ready, and that's why you have to understand that some businesses aren't going to have the proper exit strategy to get that VC money. But all businesses could still continue to take care of families. With the regulation, what I'm worried about is how are these people going to transition? People are this was brace money. This was college money. I know so many people whose parents sold drugs to get them to college. Now you get to sit pretty and act like you don't want to, do the work to push the movement further, which is fine because it's a lot to risk. It's risk and reward. But what we do at the Hood Incubator is we try and provide the container for folks to take that leap and do it in a respectable, safe, with support, and not get taken advantage of. But what we need to remember is that legalizing marijuana is not enough. We need to look at what happens afterwards with implementation. Folks are being regulated out of the business. My brother was regulated out of the business, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of more people like him. Some will choose not to be regulated out of the business, and then they will be arrested into the jails out of the business. And that's when we have the war on drugs 2.0. It's not over the war on drugs, it's just changing its face. Now it used to be illegal to sell drugs, now it's illegal to sell drugs this way. Nothing's changed, there's still opportunities for us to get locked up.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, legalization is not a fix for oppression in this country. Legalization is not going to end discrimination. Legalization is just one piece that we need to start with, but we need to also talk about policing reform. We need to talk about economic opportunities and in communities that need it. And we need to talk about repairing all the harms that prohibition has created in communities.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I just wanted to add a little bit to a few things that have been said. So what I didn't add earlier was that, so we had this raid that came down on us, and those 5 of us that were hustling, and 3 of us were black, and all of the and two of us out of the group were white. This was we were in St. Louis, yeah. So I'm from Ferguson. This actually happened in a spot a little bit outside of St. Louis called St. Charles, and all three of us we were actually all from like different areas, but the three of us that were black all ended up going to prison. The two white folks never stepped foot in a prison cell. Not only did they, it's completely, there's nothing on their record. And we were all, hustling the same hustle. And to add to this conversation is, so, I just mentioned to you that I got out, I'm now, endocrinologist, doctor, professor, all this. I also, my first original path of thinking, I also have my MBA. So after I got out of prison, I actually simultaneously got my PhD and my MBA, and I completed at the top of my class. School was never, I don't say that, whenever I mention that, school was never really, I was never really the most intelligent person in school, but what I had were these transferable skills. Yeah. So to go back to this idea of, it's not only, the guy with possession, the guy or girl with possession and these lower drug charges, the folks. So my counterparts that got hit up, the two white guys, they're now successful business owners. Mm. They now, one of my, we still keep in contact. He's now a successful. He owns several different businesses in that same area that he was, moving pounds of weight in. And he's down with the movement. Yeah, I can say that. Yeah. I can say that. But the point, that's not even the point though, because for him, it's like, don't hate the player, hate the game. Like he was born a certain way that gave him the privilege to be in the position that he's in. And, unfortunately for, the large majority of us from certain communities, we're not in that. The point that I was getting at is that clearly, he had business acumen. I have business acumen. These are transferable skills. It's not only, we can't not only try to push to let folks who are nonviolent, these smaller drug crimes, a lot of the folks, these are, I now run a program called Prison to Professionals where we're helping folks reach their full potential by means of educational attainment. And, I've partnered with groups like Just Leadership, who are, is a group that's looking to cut the prison population in half by 2030. And it's doing so by means of empowering formerly incarcerated folks. So we need to be at the front line of the movement, really. And the same thing in this here, because, we're really, a lot of people say, oh, it's maybe somebody who's growing, they're an expert. But no, we have the same skills and business acumen as the, professional that's sitting at the table.
Yeah, no, thank you. Because there are two things that I think came out in both what you said and what Lenise said. And one is regulation and how it's, if not framed appropriately, how it can be more harmful than good. And then the second thing is developing that next generation. So Hood Incubator is here. I encourage you all to look them up and to see the work that they do. And then also Women Grow is here. All right, and we want to talk about the work that y'all do as well, empowering the next generation of entrepreneur women. But Lenise, you have one more point?
Yeah, I just wanted to say like one thing. What's really cool about the opportunity to create. So when we think about the end of prohibition for alcohol, we think about some of the legacy brands that came out of that, including the Kennedys, and able to launch a political dynasty out of bootlegging. And then so there's that. So we also think about the end of prohibition for numbers, which became the lottery. There hasn't been an opportunity each time that they've ended something that was a vital source to the black family's income. We haven't had that opportunity to make money on it. One thing that now it's cannabis. Is it going to be different? I don't know. We're not looking like that, but we are here. We're trying to do the work to stop it, to turn it around. But what you were saying, like when I think about folks that are famous for selling drugs, like I think about Rick Ross, who's speaking at our pitch day tomorrow, or I think about Little D, Dara Reed. These are people who touched millions I think Little D had $1 billion operation going on in Oakland before he was 20. Rick Ross was running $1 million operations. When he went to prison at the age of 28, he was illiterate.
This is the real Rick Ross. Okay.
Yes. So what I'm trying to get at here is hand Rick Ross a legal permit. Exactly. What can that nigga do? You know what I'm saying? Like, how many people did he have employed when he couldn't read? He can read now. He's got a doctorate now. How many people do you think he can employ? And it's what we want to do. We don't want to create these mom and pops. Give Darryl Reed a permit. These brothers have already proven to be business leaders, to be job providers. And yes, there was some other stuff that happened, and they did some time.
It isn't legitimate. It's not legal.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, like, we can think bigger. We can think big. You know, like, and what I want to see is I want to see in 20 years from now, 30 years from now, I want to see that Jameson brand. I want to see a Kennedy family. I want to see that come out of cannabis and of cannabis prohibition. I want to see our generational wealth created.
Thank you.
Definitely. I'm going to chime in. So let me speak on the other side. When I entered the industry as the owner in a legal operation, I had 10 growers, and I went to all 10 of them, and I said, I need supply to open up my doors. And district growers, who's present here, please wave your hand, were the only cultivator that would sell me 2 strains. I had to operate a business, as if you know about the cannabis business and how I can align medicine to specific ailments with 2 strains. They were choking me. They didn't want me in here. War on Drugs 2.0. This is an example of that. Then I had one grower said, okay, with those 2 strains that you got from district growers, you're doing pretty well. You buy 10 strains from me at $6,500 a pound, and I will sell to you. Now, the average pound at that time was $3,500. So now you're charging me a black woman surplus, and you're going to make your money off of me because I have no choice. So what did I do? Well, being a black woman, who would lend me money? I can't even get a loan for a regular business. Now I'm in cannabis, and you think I'm going to be able to get money? No, I had to mortgage my home. Now, I state today, I'm the biggest dispensary in Washington, D.C. But this is the new attack on us. War on Drugs 2.0 in the legal industry, and we still don't have access like everyone else does.
Thank you. I want to get to a little bit more about the regulation side. And so, you know, just some of the things that people might not be aware as we're making this move. So as was mentioned, you know, folks with previous convictions, previous marijuana convictions not being allowed to participate in the market has been an absolute issue. There have been issues around zoning, communities deciding, oh, we don't want these businesses here, and then forcing the businesses to operate only in certain communities where people of color happen to live. This is not a byproduct of marijuana legalization itself. This is a byproduct of continued white supremacy, continued decisions on how we should live. We're recognizing now that there are small, little notes in these legislative bills, these ballot initiatives that create what's going to be the linchpins of this market. I want to just pull out to the panel, you know, some of those other issues where we've seen that this has been a gap. This has been a barrier to entry for people in the market. This has been a thing that's prevented people. We've heard capital mentioned, access to capital. What are some of the other barriers that people have had to getting into the market? I don't know who wants to take that one.
I can
yeah,
throw
sure.
some off. So when we back up to thinking about when it's getting legal and then they're going to start the regulation process, there are ways that can immediately just take out the average black hustler so that they won't be able to transition. What's it called? Vertical integration, in which your cultivation license has everything, and so places like Illinois has their license is the cultivation site, does the edible infusions, does manufacturing, There is no transportation that happens at all because it's all in one place. So that's a license that doesn't exist. And then the dispensary is right there as well. So that's one license. So instead of breaking down the supply chain, it's all in-house. So you have to think about the amount of capital that it's going to take just to even be able to have to apply. Some of these licenses you have to have show that you have millions of dollars in the bank. So like that's not necessary. Like you can if you were to, some places are banning delivery licenses. That's an attack on what is the black hustler is the most. If you think about the retail end of it, that's the most obvious transition over is the delivery service. Most people aren't having folks come to their house; they're moving around, going to people. So that's a delivery service, yeah. And so I just think in the regulations we have to be careful. How are they regulating this plant? Are they requiring to have millions of dollars in the bank? Well, that's already cutting people out. Are they requiring that you have you're doing the whole process? Are they banning delivery services? There's a lot in the regulations that are going to take people out of the business before they even get started. So just regulate progressively. And California has a decent model.
So there's usually 3 aspects to applying to a medical marijuana enterprise. You have to have the application itself. The application is very detailed. The one I just completed for New Jersey was 719 pages. How many people have the skill set to write an application with that much detail and requirement? And so most people actually have to hire an application writing firm to do it. They will charge you anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000 to write one application for dispensing. Then another $50,000 to $150,000 for processing, and then up to $300,000 for cultivation. There is a formula that we do not know, and they are the gatekeepers of that, and those people who have access to that knowledge will continue to prosper, but we don't have access to that knowledge. The second aspect to applying in the enterprise is real estate. Real estate has so many regulations because there's something called protected entities. There's no drug-free zones we cannot locate within. We cannot locate depending on the zoning requirements. So when you go and look for a space you want to apply for, you find one that meets the regulatory 1,000 feet away from schools and daycares and community service, and the landlord says to you, okay, I'm gonna charge you $10,000 a month until you are awarded just so that you can have this lease. What are you supposed to do? And so in my case, I'm thankful for my husband because I held mine for 2 years before I was awarded. And, you know, without the support of this black man right here, I would not be here today. So thank you, husband. Thank you. The third aspect to that is that now you have to show proof of funds. Well, what happens if you are a part of this industry and you have made millions of dollars, even if it's locked up or buried in your backyard, that is not allowable by state regulations. You cannot show a picture of it. You cannot submit it and say, I have done all this. It has to be in the bank. Well, how can I get my money in the bank? If you can afford $2,000 a month in fees for the banks that will allow you to use, then yes, you can in fact put your funds in there. But in order to apply, you have to have those proof of funds. In this instance, how many of people in this room can afford to do that? This is called inequality.
Thank you. Absolutely. And so, you know, a couple of things that came out there, you know, we heard prior convictions, we heard high licensing costs, high capital costs for participation entirely. These are all things that on the state level we've got to be able to tackle. And in the Marijuana Justice Act, we've got to be able to make sure that we're making states make policies that do not just block us out of this industry, because that is how you get to a point where we have such alarming disparities in participation.
Actually, the respect resolution really gets into suggestions for states on how to really move forward and not have people locked out of the industry. The Respect Resolution has provisions that encourages states to not have licensing caps for one. And a lot of the things that you mentioned here, monetary issues, diverting profits to small business owners, diverting profits to funds that like help people enter the industry. So I think, again, having a Champions in the Hill, Barbara Lee sponsored that bill, having them continue to champion the fact that people most impacted by prohibition need to be able to enter the industry.
Thank you.
My mind actually went to the Respect resolution as well. I really encourage you all to read that resolution if you have time, because just the opening really lays out how the war on drugs has been a war on communities of color. It's really beautifully written. It's really strong. But it does offer at least a start where we can go with businesses and licensing, although there's just so much we need to do beyond what people here have pointed out and beyond what we've seen at the federal level in those bills. Actually, one thing that you brought up earlier was just criminal justice consequences. So even in states where we've seen that marijuana has been decriminalized, the disparities still exist. It's still people of color, it's still young people of color who are getting criminalized for marijuana use, for marijuana possession. We've seen it in Colorado. While arrests have gone down, the disparities are still absurdly high and far-ranging for communities of color. We've seen it here in Washington, D.C., we've seen it in New York. So we have a ways to go. Legalizing is really just like a basic start.
Can we get into some of these parallel issues, like including immigration, but also maybe Jasmine, you could lean in here as well, parole, probation. You know, folks got to remember that marijuana prohibition and the war on drugs, those policies have been interwoven throughout society, right? So family law, as it relates to family law, as it relates to education funding was brought up earlier, but also folks who are on parole or probation. In New York City, for example, 30% of those who are violated is because of a marijuana positive toxicology. So we're talking about ending mass incarceration, but this is a key thing. And even as we're moving towards reform, this is still in place to make sure that those things. Can y'all two talk about, some of those other issues that we need to tackle as we do reform? Criminal justice issues?
One of the things you're hitting on is drug testing, which is something that members on the Hill continue to push for public assistance. SNAP, which is food stamps, TANF, now Medicaid, the idea that you need to get drug tested to be able to qualify for health care assistance is absurd. Yeah. It obviously doesn't, they suggest that drug testing allows them to identify people who are struggling with substance use. And I think part of the conversation we're not having is that we need to destigmatize drugs and drug use is normal and it's okay. The majority of people who use drugs don't do it in a way that's problematic. So identifying people by drug tests isn't necessary when you're thinking about job applications, people who are struggling to not use drugs so they can pass a drug test so they can do their job. It's not necessary. People who use drugs can function in our society. It's actually a small number of people who are struggling with substance use issues, and it's usually always a tangential issue that's going on with people who are struggling with substance abuse. So really invested in trauma-informed care when we're trying to deal with people who struggle with addiction. So I think people are just misled people who are making our policies are misled when it comes to how to handle people who use drugs. And they continually put policies in that discriminate against people who use drugs.
I just wanted to add in, something that is still very much related, and Senator Booker mentioned it, is some of these collateral consequences like felony disenfranchisement. So when I was incarcerated, one particular moment that stands out amongst a lot of different things while I was away. I was in a maximum security prison during the 2008 elections, and I was in a state prison in the state of Missouri because of this particular place normally has about 400 people in a housing unit, but because of mass incarceration, they actually had bunk beds outside of the cell. So this is a maximum security place where it's 22-hour lockdowns. But it was so many people they couldn't even lock them in cells. They had them actually on bunk beds outside. And so it was double the amount of people. So it was about 800 people in this housing unit, and about 75 to 80% of them were black. And I just remember the night of the 2008 election. It was just crazy. Like in prison, you know, there's like a space issue, and there's all types of things that you don't do in prison. But on this particular night, we have folks hugging each other and high-fiving each other, and this was right around, I know y'all familiar with the Young Jeezy song, like we was like a church choir, like singing My President is Black, like it was just crazy. And, you know, it was this euphoric moment, but after all that died down and we're hugging each other and we're feeling good and hopeful about change, it really dawned on us, at least on me in particular, that, you know, I'm not even considered a citizen in this society anymore. This wasn't even a victory for me. I will never ever be able to take part in this, is what I was thinking at the time. And you know, I learned now that there's different laws amongst different states. For instance, my home state of Missouri, despite all the accomplishments that I had, they still consider me as being not rehabilitated. For the past 17 years, they've taken away my constitutional right to vote. I still can't vote in my home state. But, you know, I was fortunate enough to be able to vote in Maryland. But the voting for the first time, and I wish I had a better presidential election, but for the first time in my life, you know, this past presidential election I got to vote. And I was sitting in line as this long line in Maryland. I live in Baltimore City. And, you know, people are like, man, I got to get back home. I'm hungry. Like, I'm going to have to work. And I'm sitting there just bouncing around like this excitement inside me because I've never been able to take part in this. And it's an important thing to take part in because as we're talking about changing these laws, if I'm back in my home state, I can't even vote to change the laws. The person that it affects the most can't even vote to overturn the law. And as Senator Booker mentioned, there's a couple of states like, you know, now I'm doing well, you know, I'm a professional, I'm making good money. One thing that I will never do if things stay the same is I won't ever retire to the state of Florida. Because in the state of Florida, people with criminal convictions can never, ever vote if things don't change. And that's actually coming to the point that it's about 30% of black people in the state of Florida can't vote. If it continues along the same path, it's going to be, within the next 10 years, over 50% of black people. That's slavery all over again.
Yeah. There are 1.4 to 1.7 million people who cannot vote in Florida now because of a felony conviction. Human Rights Watch, with a lot of our other allies, are partners in the Yes on 4 Second Chances campaign to hopefully change the Constitution, the Florida Constitution, which this provision was created during Reconstruction, right after emancipation. And so we know that the civil death is really tied to, you know, the black folks becoming free. I wanted to jump in on a few more criminal justice provisions that we have problems with, and I want to start sort of at the beginning of the process and go to the end of the process. Of course, you know, drug law enforcement is deadly for us. In the past, it has been deadly if you are on the corner. It turns out drug law enforcement and the smearing of victims who are, suffer at the hands of, police violence are smeared with drug use. You see this week, even Brother Gene, who was murdered in his home, has now been tarnished with having marijuana in that home. The marijuana didn't kill him. A white police officer who broke in and burglared his home killed him, right? And so this is the problem that we see. I mean, the reality is half of all Americans admit to smoking marijuana at some time in their life. I don't want anybody in this room to raise their hand. Put your hands down. You don't have to call yourselves out. But if you look around this room, I mean, imagine how many of this is there. You know, DC, it's legal now to have an ounce on you. Don't check my back. I don't. But I'm just saying, you could, in fact, in this room, have up to a legal ounce in your possession on you, right? I think what we need to understand, too, beyond the excessive use of force, deadly use of force, and drug law enforcement is the next phase. You've been arrested, but you haven't been convicted yet. You're trying to determine whether or not you are going to come back to court for this case that you got and whether or not you're a risk, a public safety risk, right? This is where the bail process comes in, and we have to get money bail out. We have to end cash bail because we know this is a system that undermines and keeps us locked up longer while states are making money off those beds, right? Okay, so we have to end cash bail. We also can't use risk assessments because those risk assessments are also racist. They're based on racist enforcement information. If We're saying that law enforcement who goes into your neighborhood and extracts you, terrorizes you, that data cannot also be used and be considered race neutral because it's now data. Okay? That data is still implicitly biased, and so these risk assessments then carry on. Drug War 2.0, this risk assessment that's now the new answer, it carries on that institutional bias in that decision-making process. So we have to end cash bail, we have to end the use of risk assessments, and create a more robust, challenging process where a person who's been accused of a crime can talk about whether or not they're likely to come back or likely to reoffend in a different way. Then we move to the actual cementing of the charges, and that's where the prosecutorial power comes in, right? We have got to rein in these prosecutors. They have way too much discretion. At the federal level, you hear Jeff Sessions now throwing out Eric Holder's huge, successful Smart on Crime initiative and telling federal prosecutors, charge it all, charge the hardest penalty, as much time as possible. This is not where we are in this century, right? This is a throwback to an old century. I like to say a lot of the work that we do in policy change is really dependent on a broken clock being right twice a day. Yeah. It's not always about converting people. It's just about getting people to do the right thing at the right time. And I have to say, I fear Jeff Sessions 2 times are over. He did help with the Prison Rape Elimination Act in 2003 as a champion, and he did, in fact, help lead on the Republican side with reforming the crack disparities. So I'm sorry, he's already been right twice. So then we move on after the prosecutors have all their discretion, and one of the things we're working on at the federal level is trying to rein some of that discretion in by giving judges the opportunity through the safety valve, which is a set of criteria that judges can determine if people should be excluded from mandatory minimum sentencing application. We have to get that passed. It's a part of the negotiations between the bill that Senator Booker and Senator Grassley, who's the Republican chair of Judiciary, and Senator Durbin are championing on the Senate side to promote sentencing reform. It has been, unfortunately, watered down in these negotiations because of the bad bill that the House passed, the First Step Act, which had a bunch of CBC members supporting. And the First Step Act is none but a back step, okay? The first step was the Fair Sentencing Act. This step is not a step forward, it's a step backwards because it relies on, 1, a risk assessment, 2, programming that we already know doesn't exist in the Bureau of Prisons because the GED backlog is 5 years long. That's one program, okay? And then thirdly, it is predicated on halfway houses being available for people to come out once they've somehow passed a risk assessment and somehow gotten through programming that doesn't exist. They get to go to a halfway house. They don't get their sentence cut. They go to a halfway house. Guess what? Halfway house money cut too by Jeff Sessions. So we have a Bureau of Prisons that is dysfunctional at best, with no head at the helm because he was sick of being used between Sessions and Trump as a pawn and resigned the day they had a prison summit. And we want to trust Jeff Sessions with implementing this First Step Act? Oh no. So we need everybody to really push every member in the Senate to support the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act over the First Step Act and make sure to help strengthen the negotiating hand that Senators Booker, who was here earlier, and other senators have really been fighting for years. The Fair Sentencing Act was passed in 2010. This is our first legislative chance to even get that bill retroactive application. What kind of shit is this? This is not justice. We're gonna get there, but it's slow, and that's why we need everybody, and that's why it all matters.
Absolutely, absolutely. You gotta understand that one of the biggest components of this fight is making sure that we recognize that this is just a small piece, as Queen said, right? This is just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. There are so many other fights that are being waged by criminal justice advocates across this country, on the state level, on the municipal level, and on the federal level. So we've got a few questions. If folks have these cards, can y'all pass them up? I got a few questions already, but we're gonna pose them to the panel. These are questions from the audience for you all. Any cards? All right. All right, the first question. Does decriminalization mean that you won't have any record of an offense, even if it is seen as a civil offense? Does that need to be reported for jobs, et cetera? So this is a question about distinguishing between decriminalization and legalization and what takes place after reforms happen. I pose it to the panel. I can also take it. All right. So just to distinguish folks, you will hear a lot of different terms used in this fight, and you know, as you tune into what's going on with this issue. To distinguish a couple of things, we've talked about medical marijuana legalization. As the Congresswoman said, 30 states have legalized marijuana for medicinal use. Variety of laws across the states. Some have different conditions that are eligible, different processes for being registered or certified, different methods of use, different methods for licensing, for participation, all different across the state. 30 states have medical marijuana. 9 states have legalized adult use / recreational marijuana. Now, what that means is that folks who are above the age of 21 are able to use, possess, and in some cases sell marijuana to other adults. This is often confused with decriminalization. Decriminalization being squarely the removal of existing criminal penalties from an offense. Now, we, as part of the Drug Policy Alliance and the advocacy world, have worked for a long time to decriminalize not just marijuana, but all drug possession, recognizing that it does no good in increasing community safety and, you know, reducing the use of a substance in any way. I want to just make this distinguished because I think this is very important. We recognized a long time ago as well that decriminalization was not enough to fully undo the harm that's been caused by marijuana prohibition, including the sealing, vacating, expunging of criminal records. So decriminalization will not clear criminal records. Legalization has the potential to do so if it is done intentionally and with those kinds of provisions included, as what happened in California and Massachusetts. Many other states are also working on this issue, New York included. All right. Sorry if that was a long one. All right, I can't do all of these. All right. Okay, these are long questions. Okay, so thoughts on setting aside cannabis tax revenue to support restorative justice activities for drug offenders. And y'all can talk, this has been mentioned a couple of times throughout the panel, but y'all can definitely talk about that.
Yeah, it should happen. In California through Prop 64, but can you put the end of that, can you restate the end of the?
Okay, thoughts about setting aside cannabis tax revenue to support restorative justice activities for drug offenders specifically.
Okay, so in California, through Prop 64, there is the community reinvestment aspect of things. About $500 million will be going to a youth fund, which will deal with drug issues as far as rehabilitation. We're hoping that it's not those, it depends who applies for the grants. I personally am hoping that it's not the traditional rehab folks who just seem to be running more of like a bad business model where it's just counting heads and folks don't actually have a problem, they're just taking them and getting the money from the state. We're hoping it's actually more useful programs that the money would go to, but there's a pot for there. Then there's also a pot of money, 10 mil each year that will increase up to 50 mil and then cap there for the rest of the years. And that also would be going, some of that money, it depends on who applies for the grant and then who gets grant. But again, drug offenders, not drug offenders, programs that support drug offenders will be able to apply for both those pools of money. But I think it's important, again, about the implementation and looking at who actually gets information to apply for those grants, and then who is the gatekeeper and who decides what the voters meant.
I'm going to jump in here because I've seen this manifest in 2 different ways. For example, the state of Florida, for every person that enrolls in their medical marijuana program, they set $10 aside into a fund that is managed by FAMU. And FAMU is then engaged to decide on how those monies are spent for education. Now, so I've seen it on the state level, but I've also seen it in a business level through social what was it? Social responsibility. So social corporate responsibility. So when you apply now for applications, they want to know how are you helping these issues in the community, and doing that by saying that you have reform policy, monies will be set aside for expungement clinics, for business development, etc. Now you can see how they're supporting that on the business level, and they are in fact being scored and given extra points for those different programs on a corporate level. So state and corporate, we've seen that start to emerge. So that's the fail. That is exactly the fail. In the state of Maryland, there was legislation, it was law that minority-owned businesses would be incorporated in the process in Maryland, and there was not one black grower that was awarded despite what the law said. So one, racism. Two, who actually implements those that actually grant it? So to see the overseeing of that, now in corrective actions, the state of Maryland is gonna open up and allow 5 different licenses that are strictly for minorities to fix that. But because it's the lack of our voice and us being in those rooms when those conversations are happening, they're getting away with it. And so this is where we call us to come into play and call them out on what they're not doing. But that's the fact. So really, when they apply, it is the commission, regardless from one state to another, to decide who is truthful enough to complete that mission, because otherwise there is no way to regulate it.
So I just want to just say thank you to Jasmine. She's going to have to run, but I want to say thank you to Jasmine for not just the work that she did today, but the work that she does every day.
Come to fruition today. I'm so glad to see this.
Thanks so much. And I also had a quick response. We're going to speed up the responses on this just because we're running on time. But we've got to recognize that states have been spending a lot of money enforcing marijuana prohibition, a lot of money. So not only is legalization a big revenue boom coming to a state or a municipality on this issue, but it's also a cost-saving measure because even all the programs you got to put together to implement regulations will not cost quarter as much as it costs to enforce prohibition in terms of court costs, police overtime. Especially coming from a state like New York, I know that's a hefty fee, somewhere between $600 or so $million a year for the state to enforce marijuana prohibition. So we need to not only guarantee that we get that revenue to rebuild communities, but also make sure that we get some of that cost saving that they're using as well. So I got a couple more questions. These are going to be, you want to get in?
Yeah. Just to throw out there, reentry services needs to be a priority for tax revenue from the marijuana industry. It costs a lot of money, and there are a lot of great CBOs, community-based organizations that focus on reentry, and they have a lot of great models where it's peer-to-peer, but they just don't have funds. Like, people deserve to be paid for the work that they do. Mentorship deserves to be paid for. So having like formerly incarcerated people mentoring other folks in the community should have funding, and a lot of community organizations are struggling to have impact in the community because of the lack of funding.
Thank you. So this is a grouped question, 3 questions along a similar topic. How can we get funding? How can folks access funding currently? I think there's a response there, a short response, but I think also a push for advocacy there. And then also what can be helped to transition entrepreneurs into the industry here in Washington, D.C.? I don't know if y'all want to be able to speak to that. And then just talking a bit about what additional movements on the advocacy side needs to be done locally so that folks can help bring about this new industry change to their state. So those are my 3 questions along the same lines.
Okay, I'll try and tackle the one that I remember the most. One thing that I think is important if you're starting a business is to not just think about yourself. We have a pitch day tomorrow. We've been coaching 10 entrepreneurs through the process of figuring out either their idea or growing their business. And one thing that it comes to at the end of a deck is the ask. And it's like, it's like people who are real selfish when it comes to like thinking about their business, and they're just like, well, I need $1 million. And it's like, okay, well, have you thought about what type of businesses are getting $1 million investments? And have you made yourself that? Like, are you investor worthy? And so most of the time, the answer to that is no. And so you used to have like half-ass ass. People are just literally, it's two parts for an ass, but people are coming with one part of the ass, which is I need $1 million. Okay, what is the person getting for that? And if you can't offer anything, you shouldn't be asking for $1 million. But you might have a good idea, and you might have a business that you're able to run, but you have to actually understand, you know, what your exit strategy is, and if you even have an exit strategy. And if you don't have an exit strategy, if you want to run a business and keep it and give it to your kids, who's giving you $1 million for that? I'm not investing in you to have a nice family business. I'm investing in you for you to exit so I can make my money. So you're not even aligned with thinking about the proper ways of getting money. So that's like the first issue is like, don't be selfish. Like, think about the investor, and that's how you're gonna get money. And then two, if you realize that you're not investor ready, as in the forms that VC money is looking for, that's fine. There are other ways to get capital. Black Wall Street wasn't built from VC money. We can pool our dollars together. We can work cooperatively. If you have, depending on what, I don't want to go too much further on that part, but like you have to think creatively, because I don't want, like, white money wants a certain outcome. And if you want to go for that white money, you're going to have to cater to that outcome. If you want to cater to yourself, you're going to have to look elsewhere. And it's not a bad thing to take white money. Maybe you want to go public. Maybe you want to get bought. But if you don't, that's not for you, because that's what they want. And then you're just going to always be mission, values, misaligned. And so first one I say is, you know, I don't want to be that person that tells you not to go off the VC money. Go off the VC money if you're investor ready, if you have what they're looking for. But if you're not, you could still run a successful business that is earning 6 figures, that's putting your kids through college, that's feeding you, that allows you to take a couple vacations a year. And you can do that, and with that, you think about a community raise.
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump in here. One of the platforms that I work with is Women Grow. And Women Grow was established in 2014 for women to help them with their business ideas, their entrepreneurial efforts. And with that, we have over the nation 17 different markets where we have leaders. Ladies, if you are affiliated with Women Grow, can you please raise your hand? All right. Yeah. So we have Black women in this room that have markets, that have started their own businesses and has helped others with their business and entrepreneurial efforts. And so with them doing that, we're able to have what we call a signature networking event. And at each event, there's a guest speaker that comes in and speak about the cannabis industry to equip you with some of the information you need to build your business. And so that is our grassroots approach to doing this, and our company has been very successful in helping women launch their businesses. In this month alone, we have Desiree, who's about to open her own clinic in Philadelphia. We had Kia have the Black and Experience here last night at Congressional Black Caucus. We have Kibra, who's starting her clinic as well. And so and so with all this, we are empowering each other and supporting each other to move forward in building our community. Also, the other platform I work with is from the Minority Business Cannabis Association. We are responsible for the expungement clinics, so that if you are interested in entering this industry, that we can help you remove your prison records. You know, clean your record up so you can actually consider being a player in this. This is key, for example, in New Jersey, where if you have a record, you can't even serve as a caregiver to your mother who might be suffering from some illness or can't walk because of multiple sclerosis. And because you have a prison record, you can't be a caregiver. So what we're doing is then you can't even work in the industry. We're cleaning records one by one. And we're doing this by, it's a 50C6 that have donations to help with these clinics. So yes, we need more resources to support our endeavors, But then again, we need community support. In this, what we've seen in our community, there's less minorities supporting us and making these endeavors versus white America, who are now coming in, seeing the devastation in our community, and they are willing to support us. This is a problem. This is a problem. This is a conversation we're not having, where people are actively in our community saying that we should not be involved in the medical marijuana community or recreational. Why is that? You know, who's being bought here? Why aren't you protecting our people who have these records by the reform, and two, allowing these entrepreneurial activities and supporting them, and help support the financial issues that we have?
Thank you. Thank you. I
The
want
answer
to.
is respectability politics, and that's why we're here.
Yeah. Absolutely. We've been boxed. They're boxing us out from the inside, right? These two questions are also a little bit about how people can get involved. How can they help affect change on a local level? So what, where, how should Black people seek to impact this issue? How should we use our resources? I think some of those solutions were proposed, but if anyone wants to touch on that. And then how can the everyday person fight this fight to end the war on drugs?
So I'll jump in, and I just wanted to comment a little bit on what you said, and again, to advocate for, for me, my record at the moment is a non-expungible record. I have a Class A and a Class B felony. It's the two highest classes of felony charges. So those types of drug charges are, when we talk about expungement clinics, there are some folks that, can't benefit from that. And hopefully we can move towards a direction where we start to allow some of these folks in for the reasons that I just mentioned before, with these transferable skills that we possess. And to what we can do. So I go back to mentioning this program that I run, and so we really, for me, what I would say is find a way to get proximal to the issue. And I know you all here sitting here because you are in proximity to the issue, but try to put yourself in those areas where you're extending yourself. So our program, again, is looking to help formerly incarcerated folks and currently incarcerated too. We're in a couple of prisons in Maryland where we're helping them use educational attainment to reach their full potential. So we fall in line with one of these types of mentoring programs, and I could attest to that is somewhat of a model that a lot of funders are not used to. So we have to align ourselves with different folks who are in the game, like I was just mentioning with Just Leadership, who has been able in different programs that assist in getting funding. But I think we just need to find ways, and in my case, to push forward and help folks who need the help the most. And in my case, it's, I think educational attainment is one of the ways that we can move forward with that.
Yeah. I think one point about Jail USA and the great work that they do is that they center, folks who've been previously incarcerated as the advocates, right? Advocating for themselves, not, other groups saying that this is what this community needs. They can say for themselves what they need, what type of supports they need to continue to move forward. I want to also just highlight on that question. There are tons of organizations that do this work. Where many of us here have worked with the Drug Policy Alliance. That's where we are currently. But there are many other organizations locally based as well that do this work to spend the time at the Capitol building in your state or in your city fighting for reform. Get engaged with them. Go to their community meetings. Those are all things that have been very helpful, and a lot of folks who become great advocates kind of just showed up one day, right? Just show up. That's a big need that we have as an activist advocate community, is for folks just to show up. So I want to elevate that as well.
I wanted to add to that, that storytelling is just so important. When I first got to DC, it was when President Obama was still at the White House, and that's when we really started to see a huge move in criminal justice reform. And that only happened because formerly incarcerated people really rose up and started to take leadership and run these organizations and come and told their stories to members of Congress, told their stories to the media, told their stories to President Obama. So storytelling is just so important. And it's not just people who are directly touched, it could be their family members. For instance, I have a family member who's incarcerated, and I'm never shy about that because I think it's so important for us to see the faces of people who have been devastated by the war on drugs and just really mass criminalization in this country. And we've seen the same things in the immigration space too with Dreamers. So a lot of people now are familiar with the DREAM Act and these kids who are undocumented and grew up here their whole lives. And that only happened because people came out of the shadows and told their stories. So a great way for you to actively get involved is to tell your own personal story if you have been touched or if you know somebody who has, because it really does change people's perception of the issue.
I think on a cultural level, it's important to, again, like destigmatize drug use generally, and really push back on respectability politics when it comes to drugs and people who use drugs. Because I think that's an issue intra-community-wise that folks have. Again, like, it's really amazing that we even have this panel here today, but moving the Congressional Black Caucus was a difficult feat just because of people's perceptions of drugs, like proximity to drugs and respectability when it comes to that.
Thank you. So Lenise, you go.
Oh, and then one last thing about how you can help out, especially in places where legislation hasn't already happened or they're still working on it. There's opportunities to create strong coalitions. And this is where I urge us to not be in our silo of our Black space. White people do have a role to play. Some of them are just racist, but some of them are liberal racist, and so they have guilt about that. And so they can be moved, they can be organized, and we had some luck with that in California. A lot of the moves that have been made were working alongside racist liberals and helping them, see the ideas and sharing stories and getting them, like a lot of these white boys, they literally think they're living thug life. They're like, yo, police came on my property, they killed my dog, man. And you're like, that sounds like you got lucky because they didn't kill you. But you're scared of the police, I'm scared of the police, we can work together on one issue. So, there's that.
Thank you.
And within communities, encouraging not calling the cops on people who use drugs generally, trying to push back on community relationships with police, not having police in our communities. When we can just deal with issues on our own. The smell of marijuana, I know some people have an issue with that when it comes to their communities, watching people smoke outside. I think when it comes to legalization, we need to think about how people may be impacted by public smoking and where people are able to smoke like freely and from the safety of police.
Thank you. So we are just about almost out of time. I do want to just grab a quick one-line sentence closing summation, not retrospective, but perspective about what y'all hope to see this industry become, what y'all hope for marijuana justice to look like, that the panel can present to the audience, that they can leave here and be focused on a goal to achieve. So just a quick line of what you see the future of marijuana reform and criminal justice reform and marijuana justice. One of those.
One thing to be hopeful about is that we're on the horizons of legalization. Our top Democrats have supported marijuana legalization that talks about the things that we're talking about today. I think we're really on the forefront of the movement that I think we want. I think we just need to continue to put the pressure on all levels and all different ways that we can.
Thank you.
It's going to happen. Marijuana will be legalized. We just need to be at the table. My biggest fear is that we're going to continue to be excluded, but it's good that now we're in this room, we're starting to talk about it. There's a lot of money that's come from this, which is why I think a lot of minds have been changing on it, but again, we have to insert ourselves and be there because that's money that should be ours.
I would like to say thank you to Ebony Magazine for featuring about 6 of us, Black women, in the June issue to start to change the narrative about marijuana. But I would also like to say I welcome everyone in this room to be a part of this industry and do so you can be a part of a revolutionary change for patient aspects and patient lives. So if there's one note that I have to say to you, please consider medical marijuana as the first option for a health care benefit and not the last.
So I kind of just want to echo what I've mentioned a few times is that I agree. I mean, we're here for a reason. This is the first panel. This is the first time this panel is occurring. That's happening for a reason. We're on the brink of legalization, and it's within a few years. More and more states are going to be have legalized marijuana, and for me, the equity part lies in, if you don't include folks that look like me, folks with the background that I have, we're missing out on talent. Yeah. I gave the comparison of this guy that is now a business owner because, he doesn't have this background on him. And, I'm in the path that I'm in, but we clearly both had some talent. He's more readily able to use this talent. I have all these barriers from using my talent. So we need to have folks like myself who are capable of contributing and, bringing equity to this new field we're going to be moving into.
I just hope that in the future, as more states get adult use and the continuation of the medical marijuana, that we look at regulation, that we make sure that we're not regulating people out of the business, so that we're not banning delivery services, that we're not putting caps on things, and that there's also a reinvestment in the full community, because, as I was, not everyone there's different characters in the hood. Not everyone was trapping, but everyone was affected by the trapping. Everyone was affected by seeing the police. Everyone was affected by that. And so when we think about reinvestment in the community, it should be for everyone in the community, not just the person that got the raw deal by doing the action. And so investing in our communities is important. Investing in those who did time is important. But also making sure that those people that are most likely to be successful have open pathways in the business.
Absolutely. So I want to give a round of applause to these panelists. Thank you so much for the time that you put into this work, the work that you do. I just want to say one quick thing, that in moving forward in the movements that y'all are being a part of in your home states, that you see happening on the federal level, one, if there is not a mechanism to clear, expunge, or seal records, then it's not enough. Two, if there's not a plan, a strategy for increasing diversity and equity in this industry, it is not enough. And three, if there's not a plan to take the revenue, to take the resources from legalization and putting it back into the community, it is not enough. It's not about legalization by any means necessary. We do not support that. And so we need to understand that those are three things that have to happen as we move this thing forward. So thank y'all so much.
So y'all, I just want to come up here because my name is Cassandra. I'm actually the New York State Director at Drug Policy Alliance, the office that Chris works at. Today is Chris's last day. Okay, and so I just want the room to just acknowledge the fact that Christopher has been one of the leading marijuana reformers in the state of New York. And New York is one of the biggest markets that's about to come on. And his last day was coming here to speak with y'all. And so I made sure to come here just to give him a round of applause. And New York is really big, marijuana arrest capital of the world. And so I think he actually deserves a standing ovation for using his last day to come here and have it for y'all.
I just want to emphasize, thank you. Emphasize education, we got to do this from the ground up, from the school level up. Thank y'all so much. Absolutely. Thank y'all so much.